Okay. So, okay. With this, welcome everybody to this session of the interest group on physical samples and collections. I'm one of the co-chairs, Kirstin Lehnert from Columbia University. And I'm just gonna introduce the session for a couple of minutes and then hand over. A few logistical issues here. The session is being recorded, so others can listen to it. Obviously, for some people, it's not a very convenient time to be on Zoom. When you're not speaking, please mute yourself so that we can hear the actual speaker talk. We would like to know who you are, so please fill in your attendance in the session document, and we have been posting the link in the chat, so I think we can place it there again in case others have not seen it before. And when you have questions and comments, please use the chat or the session document. Best is the chat so that we can all see that. All right, next one, Leslie. A brief introduction here to our interest group on physical samples and collections. The reason why we started this interest group is the fact that many of the data in the research data ecosystem are actually generated from physical samples, by studying physical samples, making observations on these samples. And in order to make these data fair and reproducible, we don't just need access to the observations, we also need access to the sample and to a description of the sample. So we want to make sample data reproducible by making samples fair, but also the samples themselves need to be reusable, need to be accessible, because they represent an enormous value for research in many, many disciplines. Last but not least is the reason that sample collection and sample curation, very similar to the data world, is a scholarly contribution and therefore deserves recognition. So we need to think about citation and credit for sample collection and curation, and this will be a major topic in our session today. So among the other topics that we have been talking about in this interest groups are practices, standards, and policies, which include persistent identifiers for samples, obviously metadata and terminology, both disciplinary and across disciplines. The topic of how do we discover, how do we access samples through registries, catalogs, aggregators, or harvesters is also critical, because if we have 1,000 catalogs, the samples may be accessible, but it's a pain to actually find anything. There are many policies and practices to consider around sample sharing and preservation. Specifically today about ethical collection of samples, ethical sharing of samples is very relevant. And last but not least, again, we have a topic that we haven't quite touched on a lot yet, but that is the physical infrastructure for sample preservation and access, which obviously is a prerequisite to making samples accessible and reusable. Next slide, Leslie. Thank you. So the group has been pretty active since the Plenary 10 in Montreal in 2017. We have had sessions at every plenary with different focus, some of them joined with other groups. Please go to the website of the interest group if you're interested in the history and all the discussions that we've had over these 5 years now. Wow, we should be celebrating 5-year anniversary of our interest group. Next slide, Leslie. Thank you. So here's again the link to the notes and where you can add your name to the attendee list. We have also generated a spreadsheet, a Google spreadsheet online, where if you are running a project, an initiative that pertains to physical samples, or digital catalogs of physical samples or digital data for physical samples, please add that to the list of projects so that we have a comprehensive overview of what's going on in the sort of data ecosystem for samples. Next slide. Thank you. So the focus of our session today is on harmonizing citation, acknowledgement, and credit for physical samples and specimen in scholarly publications. So we will be talking about how to cite samples, and there is obviously still a diversity of approaches, recommendations from journal editors, how to reference physical specimens, and how to list them, what metadata should be included, and all that pertains to actually fair samples. There are other issues when publishing data about samples. In some cases, there could be hundreds, if not thousands, of samples and specimens that underlie the data in a given paper, especially time series measurements, depth series through sections and a long course. So it is unclear still how to report the metadata for these samples, how to report the persistent identifiers for these samples, because there are many different ways we can do that. Is it in the metadata of the paper DOI, in the metadata of the data set DOI? Is it in the publication itself? And so on, many things that we still need to figure out. Yeah, next slide. I think this is my part. Okay, so objectives of the session today is, again, raising awareness so that you can take that awareness back into your communities, into your initiatives and projects. We want to report on preliminary work on giving credit and acknowledgements to those who have collected, managed, and curated samples and specimens or funded their collection and their curation. Second, we want to look at draft guidelines that have been developed by the ESIP, the Earth Science Information Partner Physical Samples Cluster, for proper and consistent citation in a publication that can make samples more accessible and reusable and help support reproducibility, as mentioned at the beginning of this session. So with that, I think, Leslie, I am handing over now to you. I think we have an overview of the agenda here now.
Yep. Okay, I'll take over. Thank you very much, Kirsten, for doing that introduction. So Kirsten's done the introduction and background to the group. One of our major outputs has been wrapping up the 23 things document, and Esther Plomp, one of our chairs who couldn't make it, has given us a recording. Then, as per usual, we're going to have our short or lightning talks, and we've got 2 prepared. But if anyone in the audience would like to speak and talk about some project work they're doing, there's a space there for you. So please get something ready to say. And if you don't want to say, as Kirsten said, put it in the link to that document we've got that we're trying to collect where the big project, where not so much big, but relevant projects are related to samples. Then we'll hand over to Sarah, who's going to do a activity, because we thought these publisher guidelines have been developed within the ESIP physical samples cluster, and we'd like to road test them on you, because the physical samples cluster does tend to be fairly US based, and we'd like to get feedback from other people before we start to further pursue this with some of the journals. And then just getting your thinking caps on, just a couple of things about where we go to next. In particular, do we continue the ESIP RDA webinar series on samples, and whether you've got any burning topics that you'd like to see in our next plenary. So I'll now hand over, I'll stop sharing. I'm going to hand over to Sarah because I'm too nervous to show a video, and Sarah's much better at it than I am. So Sarah, if you could show Esther's video, that would be great. Thank you very much.
All right, let me know if this does not work.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for tuning into our session.
It's working.
My name is Esther Plomp, and I am a data steward at the Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands. And I am also one of the co-chairs of this interest group, and hence why I am presenting on the work on the 23 things physical samples. I would just like to highlight that this is not my work. I am presenting on behalf of a long list of contributors, which include Sarah Ramdeen, Jens Klump, Leslie Wyborn, Clint Edrington, Mary Donaldson, John Damarov, Sharif Islam, Natasha Simons, and Wouter Odding. So these people all contributed to the 23 things physical samples output. So what is this 23 things physical samples? It is basically a flyer or a short overview of practical resources and tools that anyone who is just jumping into the topic of physical samples can use immediately to learn a bit more about physical samples. I would just like to highlight that this is by no means a format that we came up with ourselves. We have basically reused this format from previous Research Data Alliance groups who have used this. For example, the 23 things libraries for research data and the 23 things support for research data. I won't have the time today to go into that, but I can recommend looking up those outputs as well. So before we delve into the contents of the 23 things physical samples, I would like to highlight a little bit about the process of this output. So this already started in 2020 when the idea was proposed during the 16th RDA plenary meeting. So already almost 2 years ago. After which we worked on the draft within the interest group, which was presented in the next RDA plenary, the 17th one in 2021, which was basically set up as a Google Doc draft where anyone could comment or add in their feedback or their resources. And next to the RDA plenary, we also organized 2 discussion sessions for 2 different time zones so that anyone who was not able to join the plenary could jump in and contribute, as well as asynchronous contributions for anyone who could not make these time zones. And if you're a member of our group, then you've probably seen a couple of emails about this in the past year passing by. Then we finished the draft, which was available for community review at the end of 2021 until the 2nd of December. And then we implemented the feedback from this community review in early 2022, which took a while, but the output is now finalized, and you should hopefully be able to find it at the DOI that is listed in the slides. If not, that is because I finished the output quite late, so it might be that it's not yet on there, but it will be on that link. So the 23 things physical samples is basically a 3-pager on a couple of topics that are introduced on the 3-pager. I am not going to go to all these topics that are listed right now, but I'll go over them one by one in the following slides. So it basically starts with an introduction on an overview of the existing resources or challenges very specific to physical samples. So it highlights 3 publications that are quite introductionary friendly or give a nice overview of the concepts or resources that anyone just starting out in the physical sample world could start with. So these are publications like Let's Make It Easy, a workflow for physical sample, metadata rescue, Going Digital, persistent identifiers for research samples, resources, and instruments, and also one on a digital repository for physical samples, concepts, solutions, and management. So an overall overview of existing resources. Then we delve a little bit deeper into the specifics by highlighting what a persistent identifier is and how these are specifically applied to anything physical sample related. So of course, we highlight the IGSN, a global persistent identifier for physical samples, but also, for example, the research resource identifiers, RRIDs, which are used in biomedical research. And we also refer to work from another Research Data Alliance working group, which worked on persistent identifiers for analysis instruments, which are not necessarily physical samples, but generally physical samples are also analyzed using this type of equipment. So this is quite relevant. Then this is already a lot of persistent identifiers, and there is a publication on which goes into the topic of when do you use a specific identifier by Damarov et al. Then we go into metadata, and we provide some general resources to find databases and metadata standards according to anyone's discipline. So we refer to read-tree data and fair sharing, which is not necessarily physical sample specific, but it's a good start. And we refer to the ongoing work on the metadata bullseye, basically work that is thinking about a common kernel or a common type of information that can be shared across multiple disciplines, and that can then be built upon with very discipline specific metadata according to each community of practice, but basically having a shared central type of metadata that can be shared among these different communities. We also refer to the Digital Archaeological Record, TDAR, which has the UK Archaeological Data Services Good Practices, which can be used as an inspiration, and a not so beginner friendly resource on how to set up your own metadata standards, where we highlight the work that has been done for data and specimen provenance in the life sciences, which you could follow if you're interested in setting up your own metadata standards. Then we go into the topic of citing samples, and you should basically show others how they should cite your samples. Same for regular or digital data. It should be easy for people to refer to your resources, and we list 2 examples on how you could do this. And we also highlight the work by ESIP, the Physical Sample Cluster, which you're going to discuss later on in this session as well, on guidelines specifically for sample and specimen citation. So that is very exciting work. Then we go into data licensing and ownership, which is also not necessarily only a concern or thing in physical samples, but we thought it would be good to highlight some recommendations. For example, you can use the Creative Commons license for your sample data. And we also highlighted some examples for sample material transfer agreements in case you have to deal with data ownership, physical data ownership. There are some examples on how to deal with that. Then we also go into some tools which you can use to manage your physical samples and data. And there are some electronic lab notebooks which have a sample management module in particular. And there are also some specific software tools that go in more deeply into how to manage samples, for example, with generating barcodes that would allow tracking of samples. And next to that, there's also, of course, repositories, and we highlight some of the existing infrastructures that are already available for physical samples. For example, iSamples, the System for Earth Sample Registration, or CSAR, Index to Marine and Lacustrine Geological Samples, Biological Research Sample Stock Center List, or you can get inspired in order to set up your own repository, for example, a biobank or a new directory. And we highlight some recommended practices in order to actually get you started there if you want to have some more advanced resources on how to get that started yourself. So again, maybe not the most beginner-friendly resource. And finally, we close off with the communities of practices. So communities, people, researchers, publishers, funders, other stakeholders that are already very much working on developing solutions and share best practices regarding physical samples. So that includes the Earth Science Information Partners, ESIP, already mentioned, Sampling Nature, Environmental Systems Science, Distributed System of Scientific Collections, DISCO, the Humanities Commons, the Consortium of European Taxonomic Facilities, CTAF, our own RDA group, of course, on physical samples and collections, and the Australian Research Data Commons group. Then we really close the output with a call to join the Research Data Alliance. And this might not be very relevant if you're already tuning into the session, but as is traditional for also the other 23 things outputs, we basically provide a little bit of information on how you could join, and we refer back to the physical interest, the physical samples and collections in the Research Data Ecosystem Interest Group. So our own research group, interest group. And with that, that's the end of the output. So I would very much like to thank everyone that contributed to the output. And I would like to thank you for attention. And I'm hoping that you're enjoying the RDA Plenary. Thank you.
All right, that was it for the recording. Leslie, if you want to go back to the slides.
Yes, I'm just trying to do that right now. There was a question in the chat about licensing, and I don't know about the rest of you, but I'm not going to answer questions on licensing. It's got, there are creative open data commons for data sets. Creative Commons often doesn't fit research data sets. Does anyone want to answer that with respect to samples? Julianne, if you like. Oh, here we are, Matthias, would you like to speak up, please?
Sure thing. Sorry, I am not a lawyer, but my understanding is that Creative Commons 4.0 suite of licenses have added clauses that make them much more appropriate for research data sets than previous versions. So yeah, that was it basically.
Okay, Julianne, where are you from? Can you speak up? Are you still here? Ah, no microphone. Oh, N4D. Okay, just so you're aware, Matthias and I work for Australian Research Data Commons, and we're actually about to start a process with a lawyer to ask all these curly questions. So Matthias, I'd ask if you could copy that question and maybe we'll put it on the list. And Julianne, can you email myself or, yeah, none of it, oh, well, sorry, I'm not an expert either. Julianne's just put in a thing that she's not an expert. Well, I'm not, and I hate talking about legal issues. But Julie, if you could contact me, leslie.wyborn@anu.edu.au. We'll see if we can get back to you with that question. Now, as I can't see any other Hello, new message. Ah, thank you, Matthias. Brilliant offsider to have around at the various times. So thank you. Oh, right. Okay, we've got that sorted out. Okay, so now we're going into a couple of lightning presentations. Jens has got one and I've got one. And this is just a warning to you. There's 19 participants. I don't know how many are in the room because we don't have anyone there. But we're going to give you an opportunity to speak about a project that you have. Okay, Jens, do you want me to do your slides for you?
Yeah, that would be great. So we'll start with this one. So one of the things that, yeah, just go to this one. Yes, yeah. That's great. Thanks, Leslie. The thing that I wanted to highlight here is that when we think about and when we discuss metadata, we often discuss them in a fairly narrow scope out of the perspective of our application or our discipline. But when we want to build systems that are really of global scale, then we need to acknowledge that things can be very different in nature, and describing them might need to meet very diverse needs, while the registration process for the persistent identifier is always the same. So this is why in the original implementation of the International Generic Sample Number, IGSN, we separated the description from this of the sample from the description of the PID registration. Why? That seemed to be quite different from what everybody else was doing, because we realized early on that it's very difficult to find a common denominator. What would be the common metadata of an archaeological dog's tooth, like in Esther's work, in her PhD? What would they share with a matchbox, or would they share as characteristics that you would want to describe with the train engine? Next slide, please. And what we discussed in a session at Pitapalooza last year was that you could always shoehorn the description of an object into a given template. But is this what the template allows you to say, really the story that you want to tell about the object? Next slide, please. So in the old IGSN system, we separated the registration of, the registration process from the description. And in describing the registration process, we kept it quite minimal to say only this is the identifier that we registered. It was registered by this particular registrant. It's related to those objects, and we keep a log of what happened over time. And so really only describing the registration process, not the object itself. Next slide, please. And in the old IGSN description metadata, for its focus in the past on geological and environmental samples, we also try to keep it quite minimal in its common elements, to say this is how we identified, this is how we collected it, this is things you might want to know about the sample curation, and again pointing to related resources. But the thing is that what is emerging now as a trend, not only in the world of physical samples but also in data, is that people recognize that there's so much more that you can say about those things that don't fit into, say, DataCite metadata or ISO 19115 or any other popular common standard. We want to portray that richness, and the landing pages are a place, but if we just let them run, then we would go back to unstructured chaos. So there are things in progress at the moment, working on how can we align what we portray on the landing pages of the objects that we describe so that they become useful, they become rich, and they are machine readable. And that's it for now. The message that and the hypothesis that I want to leave you with is that we should not try and put everything into one box, but to think about where we put things, where we describe the registration of persistent identifiers, where can we share common elements, and where do we put all the richness of the description that we want to share with others about the research objects, the samples, the data that we want to share. Thanks.
Thank you, Jens. Does anyone have any, before I start my presentation, does anyone have any questions they would like to ask, please? Of Jens? Unmute yourself, or is there someone in the audience in Korea? Oh, hello, here's a chat. Jens, do you know of best practices to track a sample through different places?
Well, we've done this with the IGSN, where we assigned IGSNs very early on in the sample life cycle, and then used them as tracking numbers to track samples as they move from the field into a field lab, into other labs back at home, through different institutions. I think this is really the strength, that it's not just another label on a box or something that you put on it when you put it into the archival collection, but you can use persistent identifiers like tracking numbers to help track things across institutional boundaries.
Julianne's added like a history of places, persons, labs that handled a sample. Yeah.
That is a very good question that we asked ourselves in how would we design such systems, because who knows about all of this? How do you keep that information current? If you put things into a central catalog, somebody needs to have the control and do the editorial work. If you keep information at where the custodian of that information lives, then you have a better chance of having the relevant and up-to-date information. So there's no one size fits all, but I personally advocate for decentralized versions where the identifiers help you identify what you're talking about, but the information about that object is curated by the local custodians because they know best what the current status is.
Okay, thank you, Jens. Does anyone else have any more questions? Julianne says thank you. Okay, well, I'll now just throw out a 5-minute lightning presentation, which came from the Earth Systems Information Partners Research Artifact Citation Cluster. And Sarah Ramdin and I were both members of this. And what we're investigating is aspects of referencing and crediting the artifacts of research. And so we took the contributor roles taxonomy credit and asked if it could be applied to denote credit for research artifacts, including software, data, learning resources, physical samples, and semantic resources, taxonomies, ontologies. We also looked at this excellent paper by Ted Haberman, which has crosswalks to how contributor roles can be described in things like credit, contributor role ontology, data documentation initiative 19115. And found a wealth of roles that could be applied from these formal taxonomies if you so wished to do. But we got bogged down. And I've got there a reference and note. These slides are available through the notes, and it's a pretty phenomenal spreadsheet. And we take each one of those artifacts, software samples, etc., and try and apply these roles and rated them as to whether they were an important role or whether they were, a secondary role. And it got very complex. So as you can imagine, with collecting a sample, the funder, the person that went out in the field, that's important. But then when you bring it back and you're archiving it at the end, the important thing is, where is it archived? Who's looking after it? What are the roles associated with archiving? And I think Sarah can correct me, we ended up dividing the samples into two, depending on where you were. But critically, we both felt that giving credit for samples is really important, because it's very expensive to collect samples these days. There are a lot of regulations for occupational health and safety. And more importantly, as Kirsten touched on at the start, you need considerable infrastructure to make sure that you preserve samples, that they're there in the future and can be reused. So hence there's a move from the funders to know, well, look, we funded this trip to the Pacific Islands or Pitcairn Island to collect this sample, cost us a fortune. What research, what science has come out of that? And so they're finding that they can't get credit for where they funded a sample, because you'll just see that sample mixed up and mentioned in a research paper without all this extra metadata that enhances it. But the ESIP cluster was so overwhelmed with all the results they got from that spreadsheet that they decided to narrow their focus strictly to data citation and see if they could define the relevant taxonomy or guidelines for describing the primary role of data authorship. And they recently published their work in EOS, and I've got the reference. And so I'm just throwing out to you, because I think, I'm sorry, I shouldn't speak for Sarah, but I'll hand over to her at the end. We felt we got so far with samples, could we take it and do something more with it? Do people feel there is something that this interest group could do, or we could do a deeper dive on at the next plenary, for making sure credit for both researchers, funders, organisations, institution, for the collection, curation and preservation of samples, and ask, is anyone interested in that? Sarah, would you like to say anything more on this, because you were part of it?
Just that, going back to that concept of credit, it was something where it's not just about the person who collected the samples, but there's so many roles along the life cycle of the sample that are so valuable. And so when the ESIP group started to focus purely on authorship and then also on data, it felt like it was excluding so many other important roles in the sample side of things. And I know the ESIP physical sample cluster is a little bit biased because we're mostly curators, but there was also that role of, I might be the intermediary, the repository that's holding on to the samples for the creator, who might have been the person who captured it in the field, who might be considered the author. But then what about the repository? It's really good for them to get credit too, so they can show their value back to their funders to say, please continue to funding us of having these repositories, because people are actually using the samples in our collection and that they have this value for reuse. So again, it wasn't just this focus on data, but also the fact that they're focusing on authorship. And I think there's a lot more roles that are more valuable to samples than just that.
Okay, so does anyone want to make any more comments about doing something? Oh yeah, Kirsten's got her hand raised. Kirsten, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, one of the benefits of good metadata for samples is that, you can link to other unique identifiers. And we started pretty early on in specifically in the context of IGSN to think about the connection of a sample identifier to funding awards. And through that, very often also the connection to repositories. You know, if you list the repository where the sample is in the sample metadata. So you can actually, through, you know, if you do have good metadata, you can build a lot of, or allow at least the building of a lot of metrics that in some way provide a means to give credit. The sample repositories that we worked with were always really interested in seeing, you know, the persistent identifiers that they use for the sample, seeing those in the literature, and then being able to, at some point in the future, harvest automatically information about all the papers that that reference a given sample. So I think some important key lies in, you know, the completeness of metadata.
Okay, does anyone else want to speak or say anything on this topic? We'll circle back at the end, but just interested in whether people want to pursue it, because as we said, Sarah and I, our frustration was pretty high that we went so far, but equally as well, we respect why the group then cut back to data, because it was the most common topic and they already had so much on that. Okay, so, right, I can't see anyone's hands up. So this is just an open mic. If anyone wants to add anything on projects they're doing on samples or work you feel we could be interested in, and also bearing in mind that we would be also thinking forward to potential items for our next plenary. Does anyone have something they'd like to say about work they're doing on samples? Okay, if not, I'll now hand over to Sarah. So I'll stop sharing my screen, Sarah, and can you take over to run this deeper dive for us? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to go ahead and share the same slide deck, but this way I can navigate it. Let's see. Sorry, it'll take me just a minute to get back down to these slides. Okay. So my name is Sarah Ramdeen, and I'm co-chair of the Physical Samples Curation Cluster in the ESIP community. ESIP is the Earth Science Information Partners. And I want to thank this group for giving us the opportunity to share a little bit about what we've been working on. As Leslie or Kirsten mentioned earlier, I forget which, that ESIP is the US based, and we're also focused, as in the name, Earth Sciences. So we do have a bit of a narrow focus, and it's always good to be able to reach out to other communities. So the Physical Samples Cluster was formed 2 years ago. The goals of the cluster were to review existing tools and services from the community in order to generate recommendations and to better share things that were already existing rather than reinventing processes, tools, best practices. We also wanted to provide a space to discuss methods for streamlining workflows, building standards, and other things that would help curators across repositories. And another goal, as I've mentioned, has been to reach out to new groups or other external groups, which includes TADWIG, RDA, Spinach, ICOM, the Australian E2SIP, and the IGSN community. So far in the past, we've done a joint webinar series, which Esther mentioned briefly, and I think Leslie did too at the beginning of the session, with this group, where we've brought in speakers from the community and hosted webinars. You can see here there's been 3 webinars, supporting reproducibility in a connected and electronic lab notebook, RRIDs, a way to track samples through the scientific literature, and supporting interdisciplinary sample data discovery, integration, and reuse. And links to each of those are here in the slides. I believe you can also find them through the RDA YouTube channel. The series was paused around the holidays last year in December, just because it's kind of hard with everyone on break and leave, and we were hoping to pick it back up in the spring, but I think a lot of us who are running this had gotten very busy. So the series has been paused for now, but it would be really great if anyone in this group was interested in picking up and taking lead over the activity. So currently the ESIP Physical Samples Cluster has been focused on a project for about a year now, where we're working on guidelines for publishing samples and sample related data. And specifically, this is guidelines that we're going to give to journals that they will provide for authors. It came out of a combination of needs. It was a bit of a response from the community, and we were working on just a set of general guidelines. And in discussions within the ESIP cluster, some representatives from AGU's publication branch were there, and they were very interested in this concept and asked us to possibly be those first adopters. And we've been working with them now since to then come up with a plan on how to create these guidelines. And so we had reviewed a bunch of different possible templates and structures and discussion of what scope might be within these guidelines. And then after being approached by AGU as these first adopters, they recommended we use their data and software sharing guidance for authors as a template for our work. And so we've taken that. It's a very great document. It was published last summer. The links here in the slides, and we'll probably provide them later. But we wanted to use that as a base then to create our own version for samples. So here are some resources on the slide. First, it's a public document. It's a working draft that's comment only. So if you click on that link, or sorry, I guess you can't click on the slides, but if you follow that link, you'll be able to see our current working document, which has some questions on the front page of what we're thinking about and where we still have directions to go in. And we'll talk about some of that in just a moment. And then also you'll see some of the text that we've already written, as well as topic areas that still need to be addressed. As part of this project, we're doing outreach into different communities to get feedback, both in the content and perhaps even adoption. And that second link is a poster we presented last month at Spinach. And it's basically an introduction similar to what I've given here into the guidelines, how we were motivated and inspired to create them, and again, specific questionnaires that we have and how to engage with us and working on it, which I'll go over a little bit more here during this session. So to get into that a little bit richer, so these motivations, we've heard a lot of this already this session, that samples should be cited. It's got to do with credit and attribution and also access. And the citations, it was important that they follow appropriate protocols where applicable, that they acknowledge the organizations who provided the samples in whatever way that means to be provided, and they include a persistent identifier. And also, it's not just about citations and credit, but it's also storing that sample metadata or that related data along the sample life cycle. So researchers might need to know what to do at the very beginning when they collect samples versus at the end when they're archiving and maybe putting them away for long term. But some of that guidance has to go into when you're citing them in your publications as well. And so the guidelines themselves cover a number of different topics, but this is on a high level, includes how to identify physical samples in your publication, how to select a repository for your samples, as well as for your sample metadata. We're still debating whether or not sample related data is within scope of these guidelines, or if we would just point to the existing guidelines on data the AGU has. But again, samples have a special flavor to how they have needs. And so perhaps sample related data might have some additional constraints that are not covered in those generic data guidelines that AGU hosts. We also want to discuss how to include detailed, complete citations in publications for samples, and then how to evaluate the availability of the samples, the metadata, and the data during peer review. I think that's an important aspect of all of this process too for publication, is that you want to give guidelines to the reviewers on what they should be looking for when they're reading over a publication in order to determine whether it's eligible for publication, and how they can give comments back to the authors in regards to how the samples were treated in the publication. So our current plan is that we've been having monthly cluster calls where we work together on this document. There might be some assignments outside of the meetings where someone might work on something alone, but we try to work on these things together, again, because we want these guidelines to come from the community itself. We also have focus sessions at the ESIP meetings. For those not familiar, ESIP has 2 meetings a year, one in January and one in July. And so during those meetings, we'll host a session where we've been focusing on these guidelines in order to get a broader community engagement outside of those committed folks who join every month. And then we're also presenting these materials to different communities for feedback, as I mentioned, the spinach poster, and then this session here at RDA. Once the guidelines are complete, we hope to get review from the community, similar to the way how Esther spoke about with the 23 things that document was open to the public for comment before they finalized it. We'd like to do the same with our guidelines. And then we also hope to find other communities who might either adopt the guidelines or modify them for their domains. We do respect that some domains have slight different procedures and policies, especially we could go on forever, I'm sure, about the debate between a sample and a specimen. And so we understand that maybe these recommendations as they're coming out of the earth science community might not work for other communities, but hopefully it will give them a base of something to start from. So in today's session, I'm looking at the clock just with an eye towards, we've got, I guess, about 15 minutes because we were running a little bit behind in the other things. But we wanted to have a breakout activity in order to get something from all this expertise we have in the room. There's a lot of you here interested in samples. I'm sure many of you have a lot of content and things you can share with us. But with these guidelines, the stage we're at now, there were a couple areas where we needed community feedback, and I've got those listed here on the slide. First of all, we're really interested in this concept of sample availability. So the AGU data document had a whole section on when you should make your data available and different processes for that. Well, what about the sample? What does it mean to make a sample available? And how do you provide preliminary access to a sample? And so we do have questions about what the community opinion is on that. We also have, and Kirsten mentioned some of this in her introduction, is that we need to come up with some standards for where do you put the sample acknowledgement, like where do you put that citation? Is it in the acknowledgements? Is it in the availability statement? We're leaning towards availability statement, but we'd like to hear more from the community. Should it also go into appendix or a supplement? It probably depends on the number of samples that you're citing, which gets to that next point of, so what is the format for a sample citation? And how do you make that something that works, that scales? So maybe I could put very detailed information in a citation if it's one sample, but if I have 1,000 samples, that makes it a little bit more challenging. The last line is in gray because it's the topic that's the focus of our July meeting, is we'll be looking at some of the on-touch sections, but we do welcome any feedback that you have either by commenting on the document itself or in this session if we have time, where we want to know, so what are some of the concepts you think are important during peer review, during the paper acceptance stage, and also, again, as I mentioned earlier, that data availability statement. So I created, this document. I might need to stop sharing for a second in order to switch to that other document, just a second. But I created a breakout document to capture notes as far as what the community thought, but I'm not sure what's the best way to proceed. If we just want to have an open discussion and I can capture some notes instead of going into breakout groups, I think that might work best. So I'm going to go back and share this slide deck, and feel free to start putting in any notes that you might have, but if people want to raise their hand or just speak up, we can do this as a group, and I can try and capture some of those concepts in this document for notes.
Can you put the link to that document in the chat, Sarah, or?
Yeah. And I'll also go ahead while I'm putting things in the chat, and I will put in the link to the public version of the comment document that we have open for comments. Let's see, where did I have that?
Okay, so what would you prefer us to do? To just type directly into the document or call out examples?
I would say whatever you feel most comfortable with. So if someone wants to just put some notes in because they're shy and they don't want to raise their hand, that's fine. But since we've got about 10 minutes, maybe if anyone does want to start a dialogue on one of these points, I'd be really excited about that as well. So I think my most interested one that I don't really know how to address this is about citations in large sets. So that would probably end up going in the supplement because it'd be easier to put a table or a spreadsheet with just a list of all the samples. But I don't know conceptually if anyone has any ideas about how would you format a sample citation so it could scale. Mathis has said in the chat, wherever the sample citations go, it should be in the public metadata for an article so it's not hidden behind paywall. I think that's a really good point. And Jens has raised his hand. If you want to say something, Jens.
Yeah, Kerstin, I think, said that in her talk that for samples is even more pressing than for data, that we have so many objects that relate to a publication that we have to find a way to deal with them in the references. And one way that has been suggested has been the bit complicated term of a reliquary, a collection of precious things that can itself be identified. I like the idea because it allows us to reassemble things for different publications different ways, but also to pass it on as a package, as a container. Reliquary. Okay.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I don't
Maybe
know
we have to find a better word that's easier to pronounce.
Well, reliquary is a very loaded term as well because it's
Yes.
Traditionally about religious relics. So I've got to be very careful.
But the idea was to, it's not my invention, but I guess the idea was to emphasize that we're talking about something that's precious to us, while calling it a container sounds a bit not precious enough. But let's not debate about words. The idea is that you have something, a container, a bag, a precious box, to put things together, and the box itself can be identified. And then you can reassemble things for different purposes.
Could I just alert everyone in the audience, if you're interested in this, there is actually a BOF going on right now in this session. It's called Complex Data Citations, Formulating a Community Recommendation. There is someone from that group who's going to speak at the Earth Science Interest Group tomorrow morning, but that BOF is doing exactly what you said, Jens. And,
I didn't invent it.
Yeah, I know the name's not very popular in that group, but certainly if you're interested in that topic, it's on right now, but don't leave, stay with us. But sorry, to be really serious, they're forming a working group. So they're hoping to have something done within 12 months. And they already have made a lot of progress with some key groups in the US and in Europe.
The challenge that I see, though, with this kind of whatever aggregating concept is that you can then refer to the aggregate, but it doesn't really solve the credit question, because you would have a cascade or network of credits if you would want to then acknowledge everybody who has any part in things that went into that aggregate.
But they're arguing that you put the credit on each individual item. and then you aggregate the credits, which you're saying is too much. All right.
Well, no, I'm not saying it's too much, but this is challenging, and I've
How do you
heard this
harvest
discussion
that?
before.
Yeah, because I can see where if you put, let's say you put a citation to a less politically charged term than reliquary into your paper, and then from there, how do you harvest from it all the metadata that represents all those credit terms for each individual sample? Like, we're not there yet, I don't think, with with the linked data worlds for samples to be able to follow those threads downward.
But there's no reason why we couldn't be. Or
Yeah,
let's turn it around. Like, I know the seismologists are now turning up at that group, and there's all sorts of people starting to turn up. I'm not sure that someone from the samples community has turned up yet. So somebody's been putting some,
well, that's me. I've been capturing what we've been talking about in one of these. And
okay.
actually, so I have another pointed question. Hopefully it sparks dialogue. The second slide has that question of where do you put the sample statement? Is it in the acknowledgments? Is it in the data availability statement? Is it in a citation, the reference list? Is it the appendix or supplement? Is it more than one of those, all of those? Is there anyone who's citing samples now here who want to share where they do that now? Or if you're a repository where you recommend folks reference their samples? Or if you have a place you hate when you do see someone referencing their samples and you would prefer it not be.
I guess the only thing I'd add, again, you need to get in touch with Shelley and Chris, is that they have a project going on, and that's more for data about how to put the identifiers and these things so that they're picked up by Crossref, by not data site Scholix and those kind of things, so that you can actually start to aggregate the the credit and the use, the reuse of it. But Matthias and Jens have got their hands up. They're more expert. Matthias, go for it.
I wouldn't call myself an expert. Well, I suppose I have to sometimes. But my another thought I just had was around DOI metadata. So it might be worth down the line, if you haven't already, sorry, I don't know what you have done and haven't done, try and engage with Crossref about what you can put in Crossref DOI metadata. Because you could theoretically, put all the sample PIDs into that metadata, although if you've got thousands, that'll be a giant metadata record.
One thing that we've... Sorry, Sarah, I didn't want to interrupt.
Oh, no, I was just saying thank you. I captured that in the notes. So go ahead, yes.
I see this as a big challenge because even in data world, it took more than 10 years to get from the idea that data should be citable to some form of having them integrated into the literature. So the question for me is, why not do this in an analogous way to data? Because it's just another research artifact that we want to reference, that appears in the materials and methods section, and then we want to have it in the list. Or has anybody observed a common trend in how data get referenced in the literature?
What I do know is that a common trend is that how it's currently being done, particularly like the DOIs are being put in, they're not being picked up by anything. Like AGU has found that none of its data site references are being picked up. So, hello, someone's there in the room. Do you want to say something more on that?
Yeah,
Go
sure. So I'm Lauren Cadwalder, I work for PLOS, and we're doing some work at the moment around kind of data citations and trying to track those and understand where data is being generated or codes. And we've most recently done it with code actually for PLOS computational biology, looking at how code's been shared and cited. And for us, it's been really key to have the, sorry, I'm just going to take this off, the citation of where code's been shared in the data availability statement. So it's within the XML of the article. I'm not an expert on production or how you know, the kind of the mechanisms of where all the metadata sits, but to have it within the article itself has been really key, because it's kind of allowed approaches to be taken that have used like natural language processing and AI to look at the content of that article and really understand how things like code has been generated. So searching within the text to work out how code's been generated, and then if it's been shared and where it's been shared. And I see physical samples as kind of a similar thing. So if we can get the citation of that physical sample within the kind of the main body of the published paper itself, I think that will really help for kind of more automated methods that are being looked at to understand where things are being, the other research outputs are being generated and cited and shared. So I would caution against putting all the citations within something like supplementary information.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I feel I'm so removed from this, as I haven't been a researcher on that level in a while. So thank you. That's really informative. Okay, got that in the notes too. Just with an eye towards time, let me go. I'm going to go back to the slides. But if anyone has anything else that they want to share. But thank you. This was really useful. I think I've captured some really useful points to take back to the ESIP community. And I wanted to close this topic area by just asking you to engage with the ESIP cluster if you're interested, either in continuing working on this document and helping to see how it progresses, or just to learn more about what the physical samples group in the ESIP cluster is working on. You can sign up for our listserv, which is that top link, and I'll put these links in the chat afterwards. You can sign up for our listserv. We'll have a session at this July meeting for ESIP. It's July 21st, and you can see a description of the session on the slides there. And then we have monthly telecons, and whereas the July meeting you'd have to register to attend, the monthly telecons are open to anyone. And currently we're meeting on the third Monday of the month at 4 p.m. Eastern. Our next meeting won't be until August because of that July meeting at ESIP. We'll cancel our telecon, but please join us if you're available. And then you can also see our cluster website for more information as we progress with things. That would be the place to check in to see updates on the guidelines. And as I said, I'll put these links in the chat. But I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. Leslie, if you want to take back over.
Hang on, escape. So where do I need to go to? Okay, all right, so share screen. Okay, so there's nothing else you want to present, Sarah? I think we'll just see how we're going. As Sarah mentioned, we've got the, whether we or not we resurrect or get that ESIP RDA webinar series going again. Please put something in the chat if you want to. There were a couple of suggestions for future topics. I don't know whether people want us to go ahead with them. I guess we'd like some feedback if anyone has a burning topic for the next plenary or would like to say something on that. now is your chance. Put your hand up if you would like to. And if not, you've got the link here to come and join this group and be part of it. Just another item as well is that a couple of the chairs may be wanting to rotate off. So if you would like to be a chair of this group, do please let us know. We're particularly interested in trying to get people who are outside of the geo community, because we're currently rather biased towards it. Although, as Jens mentioned, Esther mainly works on teeth, but she's also expressed a desire to move on. So we're certainly after more chairs. And again, if you join us on that webpage, you can put an email out to the group about topics or items you would like to see discussed. So I'm just now passing over to the other to Jens, who's the only other chair left because Kirsten's gone. Jens, as chair, do you have anything else you would like to say, please?
I think for the group, it's going to be really important to broaden out into more diverse communities, to be not so geocentric. And there's a lot of things happening, and the work in the ESIP cluster especially is, I think, really quite exciting. So I'd like to thank everybody who contributed to this session, because it's a field that is moving, and we heard that fitting it into the scholarly communication is still an ongoing challenge, and it will be interesting to see at the next plenary and at meetings in the meantime how we progress things.
Okay. So does anyone from the audience have anything they'd like to say or put in the chat, or has anyone got their hand up in the audience? I can sort of see you. Okay.
Oh, just one thing from the keynote, or one of the sessions earlier today about 20 years of data science. There was something that came up that reminded me of the discussion that we were having here, is how specific or how general can you be in metadata. And there's you might remember the name, I forgot who's her name, who said that this is different cultures. There's not a technical right or wrong. It's different approaches to things. And there are people who say we want to harmonize and standardize things, and others who say, no, we need to preserve the diversity because that's the richness. And there's no right or wrong, but it's different approaches and different cultures that we should recognize for their place in the communication process.
Sounds good. And I think that's the issue we have with samples now, that once we broaden it out, everyone's requirements are so different. It gets hard to run a group like this, which is trying to listen to everyone's voices, but come up with something that's consistent.
Yeah, it becomes a bit more meta.
That's why I was really curious about this, and why I was trying to keep an eye on the time, because I wanted to see this discussion on next steps, and I wanted to see what those who are attending, who are new perhaps, what they thought they might get out of joining this interest group, and what they might like to see happen moving forward that they would want to contribute to.
Any comments? Matthias, are you still here? You usually have something to say.
I
Not
almost
meaning
always
to
have
put you on the
something to say.
spot.
No, look. So my point of view at the moment is so my job, in fact, is to try and collect together what the bright minds around the world have come up with, so I can bring that to Australia, and write, disseminate advice and guidance to Australian researchers and research support professionals. So that's why I'm really looking forward to this guidance that you're coming up with for journals. Because I also think to myself, well, where else do people learn about how to cite things? And that is, as undergrads, they learn, and librarians put together guides and resources, and who dictates those citation standards? Well, it's organizations like APA, like MLA. If you remember those citation styles before you started writing journal articles. And then the other side of things is, yeah, the other disciplines, the other, not just earth sciences, but something I'm thinking a little bit about at the moment is, for example, museum collections or museum biological collections, or indeed, Jens, this is in your organization, the national biological collections in herbaria and what have you. How do we try to engage those audiences, those curators, sorry, and how also do we incorporate the idea of sample identifiers or well, IGSNs, for example, into the software that they use to manage their collections? Because I feel very strongly that unless you make something easy for somebody to do, they're not going to do it. I think those are my last thoughts.
That's a very good point, to make things easy, because one thing that bugs me is that even with data citation, it hasn't made it into some of the tools. I don't use EndNote, so I don't know whether EndNote has a data profile, but Zotero certainly doesn't have it, even though data citation has been around for almost 20 years now. So if we, maybe it would be great if we could get things like this into the tools that we use.
See, interestingly, Zotero is open source software. So Jens, you're welcome to submit a pull request, I'm sure, to add that feature. EndNote, though, being closed source, and again, I don't just, yeah, so I think about these sort of open source softwares, closed source softwares. So the National Herbaria, sorry, not National Herbaria, CSIRO, I know all of their herbaria are moving to, or have moved to, an open source piece of software to manage their collections. Now, exact details of that might not be right, but I certainly know there's some open source software being used. And that would be a bit more straightforward to try and get say an IGSN integration into. But then we have huge numbers.
There. Sorry to interrupt you, Matthias. Introducing the identifier into the specify software, that's the package, is not the issue. The issue is introducing it into their workflows, and so that's a different issue.
But then there's well, to me that's like a chicken and egg situation. They're not going to introduce it into their workflows unless it fits nicely within the software that they use to manage their workflows. But they're not going to want to add it into the software until they've put the identifiers into their workflows, or feel the need to put things into their workflows.
So I know that it's on the requirements list. So I think the issue is more what's the value add that for those collections to introduce that, which is a whole completely different discussion that is worth having. Do you assign this identifier at the end of the life cycle when things go into the archive, or as early as possible? So from my view, it would be more important to have sample identifiers incorporated into electronic lab notebooks and lab information management systems where they are being used.
But then When they're being used, okay. Because I'm thinking about all the legacy collections, the huge legacy collections we have, or that exist all around the world. So then do we do a process of retrospective cataloging, as it's called, or only when something gets used do we then say, all right, this deserves an IGSN now, or an identifier?
Well, it depends, right? Because there's a lot of studies in libraries about that same thing of like, you might have books on the shelves that no one touches, but once they do, suddenly it's hot again. So I like that just-in-time system. Archives do it as well, just to so you don't have to spend all that time getting all your backlog when you can just focus on things when they're asked for and take that opportunity to get more detailed metadata. I'm trying to remember, it's MPLP, I think, more product, less process is the archival theory on this concept, where you do, in archives, you would catalog everything at the box level and not get down to the file level until you have the request for it. That way you're making it known that the boxes exist and making sure they're discoverable by the community, but not necessarily at that rich level they want to be able to get to the file, but you will get to it eventually.
Yeah, that would be a good approach to take. Sorry, I'm traditionally a librarian, and so my cataloging brain isn't as sophisticated as that of an archivist.
Yeah, I'm a little bit of both, so. But that did get me to something that you said earlier about how, and it reminded me of the broader International Data Week, some of the themes that have come up of the concept of professionalizing the role of a data steward, and where do we put some of these activities of who does it. Perhaps maybe there are these data stewards who are helping with these processes for samples that aren't necessarily the curator or the researcher, it's a different role. And also, where does that education start to happen? It's come up in other sessions that I've been at as well too, of that, do we start teaching scientists some of these things as being part of a scientist, but are we also then teaching these other associated roles like data stewards? I'm curious about how that will come out at the end of International Data Week, that concept of the data steward.
Okay, so are there any more comments? If not, I'd like to thank everyone for attending, and particularly you, Jens, because I know you're not well. So thank you for turning up. And I look forward to seeing you all at the next plenary. Thanks,
Sorry
everyone.
for sharing my brain fog with you. Thank you.
No, you did very well. Thank you so much for coming. It was great.
And thank you to everyone in the room too. Sorry we're not there with you all.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye.